All right, today we're going to track one of the most incredible and just relentless military campaigns in all of history, the world-shattering march of Alexander the Great.
Let's just start with a number, 11. That's it. That's how many years it took for one guy to march his army from Greece all the way to India, topple the world's greatest superpower, and build an empire bigger than anything the world had ever seen. So the question is, how on earth did he pull it off?
You know, our story doesn't begin with a massive empire. It begins with a prince, a very young man who inherited a kingdom, an army, and an ambition so big it seemed completely impossible. So who was this guy Alexander? Well, he was the son of the absolutely formidable King Philip II of Macedon, and his personal tutor, just the philosopher Aristotle. But when his father was assassinated, Alexander was suddenly thrust onto the throne. He was only 20 years old, and he'd inherited not just a ton of power, but a kingdom just simmering with rivals who wanted him gone. Here's the thing, Alexander didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited a mission. His father, Philip, had already unified Greece, and he had his eyes on the ultimate prize, the Persian Empire. Alexander decided he was going to take that plan and unleash it on the world.
And we have to be clear, this campaign, it wasn't just another war. This was a true David versus Goliath story. You have this small kingdom from the edge of the Greek world deciding to take on a superpower that stretched across 3 continents. It's insane.
I mean, the sheer imbalance of the forces was just staggering. Alexander marches into Asia with, maybe 40,000 troops? The Persian king, Darius III, he could call on armies that were massively larger, with what seemed like endless resources. But Alexander had a couple of aces up his sleeve. 1, his own tactical genius, and 2, his elite companion cavalry. And these guys weren't just horsemen, they were like a precision instrument, a shock force that he used like a surgeon's scalpel to break enemy lines at the perfect moment.
And he put that genius to work with lightning speed. So in 334 BCE, you get the first big win at the Granicus River. Boom, the door to Asia Minor's open. Just a year later at Issus, he comes face to face with Darius himself and sends the Persian king running for his life. And then that brings us to the final showdown at Gaugamela in 331. This was it, the decisive blow that completely shattered the Persian army and basically handed the empire to Alexander.
But wait, before that final battle, Alexander made this incredibly brilliant strategic move. He realized he had to neutralize the powerful Persian navy, so he just marched his army down the Mediterranean coast. This led to the legendary Siege of Tyre, this supposedly unbreakable island fortress. What does Alexander do? He spends 7 months building a land bridge out into the sea just to storm its walls. It's unbelievable. From there, he marches into Egypt, and instead of a fight, he's welcomed as a liberator.
And this is where his whole reputation starts to transform. In Egypt, he wasn't seen as some foreign conqueror. No, he was hailed as a divine figure, a pharaoh, the actual son of a god. This elevated his status from a mere king to a living legend, which you can imagine was a pretty crucial piece of his power.
Okay, so with the coasts and Egypt secure and Darius totally defeated, Alexander just walks into the legendary capitals of the empire, Babylon, Susa, and finally, Persepolis. And there, in this hugely symbolic act, maybe it was revenge for the Persians burning Athens a century earlier, he ordered the ceremonial heart of the empire to be burned to the ground. The Persian Empire was no more.
But here's the thing about Alexander. Conquering the entire known world, it wasn't enough. He had to see what was over the next hill, what lay beyond the horizon. His march was far, far from over.
So after Darius is killed by one of his own governors, Alexander actually hunts down the assassin and then declares himself the rightful successor, the new king of Asia. Then he pushes his army into the rugged, totally unfamiliar terrain of what we now know as Afghanistan and Central Asia. And there he faced his brutal guerrilla warfare, totally different from anything he'd ever seen before.
And this really makes you wonder, right? I mean, he'd already won. He had conquered the greatest empire on earth. But he just kept pushing, driving his men deeper and deeper into the unknown. How far is too far?
Well, he finally found his limit in India. After this grueling crossing of the Hindu Kush Mountains, he faced off against King Porus and his terrifying war elephants at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Alexander won, of course, but it was a brutal, bloody, costly victory. And when he announced his plans to march even further east, his army, who were exhausted and thousands of miles from home, they'd finally had enough. They mutinied. They just refused to take another step. For the first time ever, Alexander was forced to turn back.
So, the conquest was over, but the journey wasn't. The final march home would actually turn out to be one of his deadliest campaigns. To get back to the heart of his new empire, Alexander decided to lead part of his army through the unforgiving Gedrosian desert. It was an absolute catastrophe. Thousands of his soldiers, their followers, they died from heat and thirst. Just a brutal, heartbreaking end to an 11-year campaign.
But he had done it. After 11 years of relentless marching, against all the odds, the boy from Macedon now ruled the largest empire the world had ever known, a territory stretching all the way from Greece to the Indus Valley.
And then it was over. Back in Babylon, just as he was planning his next conquests, he got sick. A few weeks later, the conqueror of the world was dead. He was only 32 years old.
So Alexander the man was gone, and his physical empire, well, that wouldn't last much longer either. But the world he left behind, it was changed forever.
You see, on his deathbed, they supposedly asked Alexander who his empire should go to, and his answer was, to the strongest. What followed was basically decades of chaos and war, as his top generals, known as the Diadochi, fought each other, carving his huge territory up into their own rival kingdoms.
But even as his physical empire was shattering into pieces, Alexander's real legacy was just getting started. This new era became known as the Hellenistic Age. And it wasn't just about Greek culture spreading. It was about it fusing with the ancient cultures of the East. Think of it like this. Greek becomes the common language from Italy to India. Suddenly, ideas about science from Babylon, philosophy from Athens, and religion from Egypt could all mix and cross-pollinate for the very first time. That's the world he created.
So if we really boil it all down, his legacy is huge. First, you've got culture. These new cities he founded, especially Alexandria and Egypt, they became these lighthouses of learning for centuries. Second, connection. This new shared Greek language and culture created a common ground for trade and ideas to just flourish. Third, this fusion of East and West created new art, new philosophies, new ways of seeing the world that would influence Rome and eventually all of us. And finally, of course, his military genius. His tactics are still studied at places like West Point today. He literally wrote the book on warfare.
So I'll leave you with this thought. His physical empire was fleeting, right? It crumbled into dust almost as soon as he was gone. But his cultural vision, this idea of a world connected by a common language and shared ideas, that endured for centuries, and it continues to influence our world right now. So which one, in the end, was the more powerful conquest?